markets for you. Let's talk about what's going on between the US and China. US-China trade war is all set to intensify. President Donald Trump is now planning about $50 billion worth of tariff against China. The administration may target more than 100 different types of Chinese goods, according to Bloomberg sources, and the value of the tariff would be based on the estimates of damage caused by China's intellectual property theft. What are the implications on the new set of tariff that could be announced as early as tonight? Bloomberg economics Tom Orlik joins us from our studios in Beijing. Tom, thank you so much indeed for joining us. This is an impending fresh assault by the US government. The former China minister has said that this would be the declaration of a trade war. How are you reading the situation?
Well, clearly the situation is deteriorating. A few weeks ago, where we were talking about steel and aluminium, it was pretty easy to laugh it off. Now we're talking about $50 billion in tariffs. We'll see exactly what that means when we get the announcement, probably later today. But clearly we're now moving more seriously into trade war territory. We still think that the impact of this on China's immediate growth is going to be a fraction of a % of GDP. Even so, we're now talking about a substantial measurable impact, and the trajectory is obviously a worrying one.
Tom, I remember the last week, a few weeks ago when we spoke about it, you called it a skirmish more than a war. Now that the situation has escalated, what's the likely scenario of the many scenarios that you anticipated?
Yeah, I think we're moving, if I can stick with the analogy, I think we're moving from a light skirmish into a much more significant skirmish. At the same time, based on our calculations, if Donald Trump imposes tariffs which are worth $50 billion, that's equivalent to roughly a 10% tariff on all of China's exports to the United States. We think that would be damaging for China. We think it would knock a fraction of a percentage point off GDP, but that's not something which is going to be particularly troubling for China on a short-term time horizon. What will be more troubling for China would be if this move towards protectionism globally throws a spanner in the works of China's industrial policy. China's industrial policy is very substantially based on catching up to the technological leaders, catching up to the US, to Japan, Korea, Germany. If in a more protectionist world it becomes more difficult for foreign firms to locate their businesses in China, becomes more difficult for Chinese firms to buy technology overseas, what does that mean for China's industrial policy going forward? I think that's the more worrying question for Beijing.
What would be the economic cost of this on the United States, Tom? Many commentators have said that the US may be shooting itself in its foot by taking such a knee-jerk move. I know these are early days, but what could be the estimates?
Yeah, I mean, clearly this is not a good idea for the United States in terms of the short-term economic impact. The United States is already running at close to full employment. Wages are rising. If you impose tariffs and you cut off imports, you don't raise output, you just raise inflationary pressure. Potentially you push the Fed onto a more aggressive tightening cycle. In terms of the short-term economic impact, this is probably not a good idea for the US. The point to keep in mind, though, is that the White House isn't thinking about the short-term economics. I think they're thinking about this more in terms of grand strategy. It's who wins the great game for dominance of the global economy. And if that's what the US policymakers have got in mind, then a few quarters of higher inflation and maybe a tighter policy stance by the Fed, maybe that's a price worth paying.
You're right. Tom, one last question, and this is more, I suppose, political saber-rattling. How do you see Beijing reacting to all of this? Do you anticipate retaliatory action?
I think if we get $50 billion in tariffs from the United States, it's pretty clear that China's going to have to react to that. At the same time, I think it's important to keep in mind that China is the main beneficiary from the status quo. Clearly the status quo is going to deteriorate. The US is initiating substantial protectionist measures, but China's not going to want to amplify or accelerate that process. So I think we're going to see a response from China that's proportionate, And I think we're going to see them continuing to talk up the benefits of global trade and attempting as far as possible to kind of position themselves as the champion of that free trade system.
Tom Orlik, always a pleasure. Many thanks indeed for joining us with your views. Tom Orlik from Bloomberg Economics.